Thank you very much, Scott, and thank you all for having me here this afternoon. Fortunately, it's just a gorgeous day, so that'll make listening to a talk a little bit more pleasant than were it freezing and raining out. What I want to talk about today is transitioning to a zero carbon economy and how we can do it, but also what it's going to take. I mean, this is not going to be an easy task by any means. And what I'm going to do is go through some of the findings and conclusions in the book that Scott wrote. And that book is available online for anybody who wants to download it. And there's a site at the very end that you can go to if you want to download it. What I started out with was this fundamental problem that we all have. And we know it. That's why you're all here today. And that's whether we can reach zero carbon but without jeopardizing our economy. Because there's one thing that's very certain, and that's that we are not going to move to less and less carbon if it costs us more and more money. Right? So we have to do this in a way that doesn't end up costing us a lot in terms of either recessions, unemployment, job migrations, I mean, all of those kinds of things. Because if that's what ends up happening, it'll stop dead in its tracks. So the question is, can we move there without killing the economy? And I believe that we can, but again, it's going to take some smart thinking on all of our parts and some policies that move us in a direction towards, as you'll see in a moment, beneficial electrification. That is electrifying everything that we do with energy to the maximum extent possible, and then getting that electricity from zero carbon resources. This is the deep decarbonizing of the electric grid. But in order to do it, and you'll see why in a few moments, it's going to require an awful lot of storage, battery storage, because one of the things that we aren't going to change is the fact that we have to heat our homes in the winter in Maine. And we know we have to do that on days when it's not sunny and even days when it's not windy. And so that means we have to have some form of significant storage for energy. But it's also true that we're not going to do it without a smarter electric grid. Right now, our electric grid looks an awful lot like our water systems. You know, we have a big reservoir. It all flows in one direction to the tap. And when we turn it on, the water comes out. That's what our electric grid looks like today. And the reason it does that is because we had no decentralized generation capability over the development of that electric grid. We had big coal plants, big nuclear plants, big gas plants. But as we decentralized the generation of electricity, and you can see it on rooftops all over Maine and in small fields and so on, what we need is an electric grid that looks more like the internet. That one where power and information flows in multiple directions. So that's the fourth item that we need. And lastly, and you'll see this as I get to the conclusion of the presentation, is we need a lot of capital investment. There's one of the things that when you study this area, what you realize very quickly is that the transition involves the substitution of capital in the form of investments in solar plant, investments in transmission and distribution systems for fuel. Because right now, our energy mix is largely an operating cost fuel mix. Right? When we go to the gas station, we put fuel in the car. That's an operating cost. And when we instead use an electric car, what we do is we put electricity into the car. And when that's generated by renewable energy, that's all funded or generated ultimately by capital-intensive activities. Right? There are no operating costs on the solar plant on your roof. Right? You put it up, you leave it, hopefully, for 25 years, and nothing ever happens. It keeps generating electricity. I'm not going to go through this in much detail now, but this is where we get our energy from today. Most of our energy comes from fossil fuels. What's not shown on here is biomass, because that, I'm assuming that's going to continue to exist even into the future. But most of where we get our energy from is distillate oil for heating. We get a lot from electricity currently off the grid, and gasoline and other forms of fossil fuels. When we move to beneficial electrification, what we're doing is think of every smokestack, every exhaust pipe, everywhere where there is currently an emissions, eliminating that and converting whatever caused that emissions to electricity. That's what beneficial electrification means. And the areas that we focus on are transportation, heating. We look at industrial and commercial processes. Right? Everything, again, wherever there's a smokestack. And to give you a sense of just how involved it is and how much effort it's going to take when you walk around your communities or drive around, just look at all those smokestacks. Every single one of them has to disappear for us to get to zero carbon. And that's a fairly significant effort, as I'm sure you can appreciate. This is how we use electricity today, that blue chart at the bottom. Relatively flat, and you'll see why, this will have more meaning in a moment, but our electricity use is relatively flat. We use a little bit more in the winter, a little bit more in the summer, a little less in the fall and the spring. We use more during the day than we use at night, but over the course of the year, it's relatively flat. And this gives you a sense of our current electricity use in terms of the amount that we currently use. If we want to electrify all of our surface transportation, so I'm not counting airplanes and boats at this point, but just our surface transportation, so cars, vans, motorcycles, tractor-trailer trucks, bulldozers, everything that we generally use today for transportation purposes, that black set of numbers on the graph is how much electricity we will use. So by converting all of our transportation to electricity, you can see that we are going to double the amount of electricity we're going to use. Now, that's a good thing because we're going to reduce to zero the amount of gasoline we're going to use. Right? So the question here, again, anticipating something what I'm going to get to is, if we end up spending a lot more on electricity, that's okay, because we're going to spend a lot less and ultimately zero on gasoline. Right? So for those of you who have electric cars, you know that equation. Right? Yes, it costs you money to fill up the electric car at night at your home, or when you go to Shop and Save or Hannaford or anywhere else and use their charges, but you don't have to put gasoline in it. So on balance, it's not a bad trade-off. But this is what it's going to take in order to convert all of our cars and trucks. If we also add on to that what it's going to take to convert all of our industrial and commercial processes, paper mills, BIW, laundromats, all of the things that are currently using gasoline, heating oil, diesel fuel, residual oil, whatever, natural gas, for industrial and commercial processes, this is how much we're going to use. It's again, a doubling of what we're using today. So in order to convert all of that, plus our cars and trucks, we're going to triple the amount of electricity we're going to use. But still, it's relatively flat over the course of the year. It's not that bad a load to have to serve if you are going to even serve it with renewable generation. However, if we want to convert our houses and all of our heating, this is what happens. And what happens is, right, we increase again by another factor of 1. So now we're up to 4 to 5 times the amount of energy or electricity that we're currently using. But the problem is that it's all in the wintertime. Right? This is over the course of a year. That orange is all January, February, March, and then we don't use much of it at all until we get back out into October, November, and December. The green in the middle there is air conditioning load. That will increase when we put in heat pumps. When people putting in heat pumps, you have air conditioning also, which is one of the great benefits of having a heat pump. So this is what our electric load has to become if we're going to electrify everything. It's about maybe a 3.5-fold increase in the amount of electricity that our poles and wires are going to have to deliver to us. big expansions of our electric grid. But none of this does any good if we get this electricity from coal, or if we get it from natural gas, or we get it from oil plants, like Cousins Island down in Yarmouth. It doesn't do us any good because, in fact, it actually can make it actually worse because we're taking that fuel and converting it to electricity and then using it instead of using it directly. Right? And when we use it directly, it's actually more efficient in most instances than converting it. But what does make it attractive is that if we can convert it without emissions, if we can create that electricity without generating any fossil or any carbon or greenhouse gas emissions. So what I did was I said, okay, how are we going to do this? Let's first assume that we move towards beneficial electrification over the next 30 years. It's not going to happen overnight. We know that. People aren't going to take out their oil burners and put in heat pumps immediately. We're not going to convert all our cars to electric cars. It'll happen, but it's not going to happen immediately. But let's say it happens over 30 years, and it follows patterns that are typical with diffusion of technology, a typical kind of S-curve. Starts off slow, then all of a sudden everybody's doing it, it really rapidly accelerates, and then you get the naysayers and the disbelievers at the very end who come on when there's no other choice. And that's one of the interesting things about this, right, is that right now the problem is if you have an electric vehicle is where do you charge? Right? In 2050, if we're successful, the problem is going to be if you have an internal combustion engine, where are the gas stations? Right? That's the problem, right? Because I mean, I'm not going to live to be 2050, I suspect, or till 2050. But we've got a 1971 Karmann Ghia that I bought for my wife ages ago, and it's a cute little car. We hardly ever drive it, but I'm not sure my grandchildren are going to be able to fill it up and actually use it because by then there'll be no gasoline available, and you just won't be able to find it. So where do we get this energy from? And the answer is we're going to get it from renewable generation. And what this shows you is how we're going to do it in a way, right? Those bars that you see, that's the electricity that we will use each month, the percent of electricity that we'll use each month, assuming we've converted everything now to electricity. A little higher in the winter, higher in the in the late fall, a little lower in the summer, but also we get some air conditioning load, so we got a little bit of a bump there. The yellow line there shows you the percent of energy from solar by month. Not surprising, heavy summertime. June, July, August is where most of the solar energy comes. The other two lines, the green and the purple, that look like U's, that shows you where our energy comes from wind. And this is both onshore wind and offshore wind, when it's generated. Most of the wind energy that we will get, ultimately, when we build wind turbines on land or in the Gulf of Maine, most of it comes in the wintertime, not in the summertime. And then the blue line shows you where our hydro that we have and will continue to have comes from. Most of that comes in the spring runoffs and in the fall when we have a little bit more rain, a little less in the summertime. But when you look at those in total, what you see is something quite interesting. Right? It says we have electricity that we're going to be using in the summer. We need solar to serve that. We have a lot of electricity that we're going to be using in the winter and fall, but we have wind to serve that. So if we get a combination of the wind and the solar, we might actually be able to do this. And people say, well, you can't rely on solar. What are we going to do in the winter? Fair question. Wind. Right? Well, you can't rely on all wind. What are you going to do in the summer? Solar. Now, it's not perfect, right? There are days when there's no wind for 3 or 4 days in a row and it's cloudy out. We've all had those days. And so you do need some storage capability. But it is a potentially feasible thing to do. So what I did was I said, well, what if we figured out how much wind, solar, and hydro was available by hour on a typical year over the course of the year, and then how much electricity we would use every hour over a typical year, assuming we beneficially electrified everything, and what would happen. How could we serve that? And the first thing I did was, what if we served it all with solar? You can do it, right? And we know that there's enough solar that hits on a good sunny day, that hits Maine, in one day. That solar can power 100% of our energy needs for a whole year. Right? So it's not a question of, is there energy? There's plenty of energy. Right? We are awash in energy. The question is, can we harness it, and can we deliver it when we need it? Right? And the answer is we can, but we need a lot of batteries. If we were to do this only with solar, what we would end up needing is the equivalent of about 60 million Teslas as batteries to handle that problem of mismatch between when solar is generated and when we use electricity. Well, that's too expensive, right? We're not going to do that. But if we build in wind, and in particular offshore wind in the Gulf of Maine, we can reduce this to the point where the amount of battery storage we need is actually manageable. Because we can do it in a way that is economically feasible. But it requires a lot of renewable generation. Right? One option to do this would require about 7,500 megawatts of solar. Now that's if you look at kilowatt hours, it's 7.5 million kilowatt hours or kilowatts. A typical roof in Maine may have 7 kilowatts on a roof. So it's like putting 1 million roofs, 1 million solar roofs in Maine. Well, it's a lot of solar, but it's really not that much when you look at it in terms of its footprint. That amount of solar will require on the order of 35 or 40,000 acres of land, assuming it's not put on rooftops, as if it's just put on land. And Maine has 17 million acres of land. Not water, just this is land. Right? Not the lakes and all that stuff, rivers, just land. So it's a tiny, tiny fraction of the amount of land that we have in Maine. Now, not all 17 million acres is usable, right? Some of it's on the north face, and some of it doesn't. It's going to take a lot of work to get to it. But even if you cut that by 50% or 80%, it's still a small fraction of what's left. So 7,500 megawatts is not a lot of land. And I really want to emphasize that, especially up here, because I know there's issues with solar being developed on land and its visual impacts and so on. But these are the things we have to do. Right? We've got to build this if we're going to do this conversion. Now, over the last 20 years, we spend roughly $6 billion, as with a B, $billion on energy in Maine every year. Sometimes it's higher, sometimes it's lower, but it's been roughly $6 billion. Our GNP for the state is around 60 billion, 65 billion now. So about 1 out of every $10 that we make in Maine is spent on energy. So now the question is, and when we're spending all this on fossil fuels, so the question is, can we convert, do what I've just described in terms of building out all of that transmission, all of that solar energy, all of that wind energy? Can we do that over the next 30 years, but not increase the amount of money that we spend on energy? Because as soon as we start spending more money on energy, we're going to run into resistance. 10% is a lot. Right? We're seeing it this year, because this year in particular, it's going to go closer to 15% as a statewide average because of the rise in prices. And you can see the problems that that's creating. So if what we do is do this transition and we end up spending a lot more of our income on energy, we're going to have problems. And the answer is, if we do it smart, if we do it over time, and if we do it utilizing cheap money, because ultimately, remember, when you put a solar panel on your roof, you're investing capital. Right? You're putting out money, $20,000. And what do you save? You save the $2,000 a year that you don't give to the oil guy every year for the next 20 years. But in the first instance, you're putting out capital. And if that capital is expensive, then the cost of that solar project is going to be expensive, just like a house. Houses are a lot cheaper when the interest rate's 3% than when they're 5% or 8% or 10%. So if we can do this using cheap money, we can make the transition. And what we can do is we can do it in a way that we don't spend any more of our incomes on energy than we're currently spending today. Right? But we will completely transform the way, where we get our energy, how it's delivered to us, and the electric grid that we use, that's going to be used to ultimately deliver us power. And what will happen is where we spend that money will change. In this graph, that gray area is today very large. That's the amount of our income that we spend on fossil fuels. Above that, you'll see the amount that we spend on utility costs and energy, electricity. Over time, what happens is we get a fundamental shift. The amount that we spend on fossil fuels goes down. The amount that we spend on the grid and solar and wind turbine generation goes up. But it's a swap, right? And if we structure our utilities correctly, the Pine Tree Power is one good example of it, where we can lower the cost of this build out by using cheap money. If we develop all of the solar and the wind turbines, again, using cheap money, a generation authority, like the Maine Turnpike Authority, we can do it a lot cheaper, and we can actually get this done in a way that doesn't increase excuse me, the amount of money that we're spending on energy over the next 30 years. Now, in order to do this, it's going to cost a lot of money, right? Upfront money for long-term gain. We are going to need to spend on the order of $40 billion in new solar offshore wind turbines. Right? That's a lot of money, $40 billion. We're going to need to spend on the order of $10 to $20 billion on transmission and expansion of our electric grid. Remember, right now it's handling that blue bar, right? We got to get it way up to that, cover all the orange, cover the gray, cover the black. It's going to have to cover that. And that grid has to get a lot bigger, $10 to $20 billion. Oh, thank you very much. And so as a result, we're going to need to figure out the institutions, the ways in which we ultimately make this transition with state policy. But again, and as I say, and I emphasize this whenever I speak, this is not easy. Right? It has to be done on an industrial scale. I mean, it's nice to be able to put a solar panel on your roof. We have it on our house in Scarborough, and feel like we're doing something, and we are. It's nice to be able to, buy one car, an electric car. It's nice, we're doing something, and we are. Right? But ultimately, what we really have to do is figure out not how to solve the problems in Norway, Maine, but we have to figure out how do you power New York City using renewable energy. And you can't do it with solar panels in New York. It's way, way too much. You can't do it with wind turbines in New York. What you have to do is go outside into the ocean, up into the Adirondacks, up into the Catskills, out to the farm territories. And you have to put generating facilities out there, because that's where there's land, that's where the resource is. And then you need to move all of that energy into New York City. And the only way you're going to do that is with big transmission lines. And that's true for Portland. It's true for Boston. It's true for all of the cities. But in order for us to make this transition, those are the kinds of things that we really have to think about. And we can't be afraid to do them. It's a mobilization effort that is like war. I mean, this is a serious industrial conversion of our economy, but we can do it. And other people have looked at this as well for the US and for the world, and folks that are out at Stanford and people in think tanks in Europe, and they've done the same kind of modeling on a larger scale, and what they've come to is the same conclusion. We can get to where we need to be, but it's going to take an awful lot of work and a lot of effort. As I say, for those of you who are interested, there's you can download the book at that website, and I'll have it available for others later on if you're interested and want to talk to me later about it. But with that, I'll turn it over to Sue, because Sue's going to talk a lot about how we actually mobilize people. I'm not good at that. I'm good at thinking about solving problems. But Sue and others are very good at mobilizing folks. So thank you very much for your time this afternoon. I appreciate it.